Let's kick things off today with a three-part question, okay? First, how many chemicals are used in U.S. products and industries? 10,000, 20,000, 30,000. How many chemicals? Second, how many has the Environmental Protection Agency required to be tested for safety? All of them? Half of them? A third of them? And third, how many chemicals has the EPA placed restrictions on? Hundreds? Thousands? According to an article by Emily Labor-Warren in Scientific American, May 28, 2010, quote, experts guesstimate that about 50,000 chemicals are used in U.S. consumer products and industrial processes. Why the uncertainty, she asks? The 1976 Toxic Substances Control Act does not require chemicals to be registered or proven safe before use. Now, because the Environmental Protection Agency must show after the fact that a substance is dangerous, it has managed to require testing of only about 300 substances that have been in circulation for decades, and it has restricted applications of 5. The harmful side effects of chemicals have long been tolerated in the United States as a price of progress and profits. But in the early 1990s, a small group of scientists began to question why we rely on hazardous substances for so many of our manufacturing processes. They concluded that chemistry might be toxic simply because no one had tried to make it otherwise, and introduced a new philosophy, green chemistry. John Warner and Paul Anastas are the founders of green chemistry and co-authors of Green Chemistry, Theory and Practice. In the book, they established 12 guiding principles for chemists to follow. In the mid-90s, Warner left a lucrative job at Polaroid to found the nation's first doctoral program in green chemistry. And then in 2007, he founded Warner Babcock Institute for Green Chemistry, an innovation incubator in Wilmington, Massachusetts. Green chemists use all the tools and training of traditional chemistry, but instead of ending up with the toxins that must be treated and contained after the fact, they aim to create industrial processes that avert hazard problems altogether. This is exciting stuff because progress without pollution may sound unrealistic, but buying, storing, and disposing of hazardous chemicals is expensive. So safer alternatives make financial sense to profit-driven corporations. But they also save society, public health, and productivity costs that are currently externalized, that is, that no one ends up having to cover. And so what I'm saying is there is a simple profit motive for doing this, but all those numbers that never show up in the figures of corporations, all those public health and productivity costs that we pay because of the pollution, because of the cancers, because of the other things, lead us to society to pick up those costs, health plans to pick up those costs, people to pick up those costs, communities to pick up those costs. And so those will also be handled if we change the way we do chemistry. John Warner founded the Warner Babcock Institute for Green Chemistry in 2007 with Jim Babcock and Bill Kunzweiler. From 1996 to 2007, Dr. Warner was a professor at the University of Massachusetts Lowell and the University of Massachusetts Boston. Prior to that, he served as a senior research scientist in exploratory and media research at Polaroid. He's considered one of the founding fathers of green chemistry, co-author, as I said, of Green Chemistry, Theory and Practice with Paul Anastas. He's editor of Green Chemistry Letters and Reviews, associate editor of the journal Organic Preparations and Procedures International, and currently serves on the board of directors of the Green Chemistry Institute in Washington, D.C. Now, while those journals and so on may sound like very, inside publications, they are, just that, but within the field of green chemistry. Welcome, John Warner.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's great to have you here. I like listeners to get a feel for the people behind the ideas and the work that we talk about. So in that brief bio, I just gave the bullet points and rattled off a bit of your resume. But I know that there is a personal story for you of the path that has led you to the work you do today. Could you share that with us?
Well, it's a complicated path, but the bottom line is that I'm a classically trained chemist. I went to undergraduate at the University of Massachusetts, then I received my PhD at an Ivy League school, Princeton, and then I went to work for industry. And as I was working with industry, I realized that the biggest impediment to success in industry was understanding environmental regulations, and understanding toxicity and what it is that makes molecules toxic. I had an excellent training. I was very successful at solving industrial problems and inventing new materials and filing patents and getting things out. But the biggest problem that I found was understanding these other issues. And I was kind of realized that there was an opportunity to improve industry by focusing on these things, and we called that green chemistry, looking at how to make materials in an environmentally benign and responsible way and understanding the landscape of environmental regulations. So initially it was an intellectual activity to try to figure out, how to do things better. But as time evolved, at the same time, in independence of all of this, I ended up losing a child to a birth defect. He was 2 years old when I lost him, but he was born with a disease called biliary atresia that had, no one really knows the cause of something like that, and his liver was completely detached from his intestines, and it was just a nasty situation, and came to a startling realization. Up until this point, my focus was more intellectual about, how to improve industry and deal with environmental regulations. And all of a sudden, when I, lose my son to an unknown birth defect, I started to ask myself the questions, I wonder if something I touched, something I invented, actually caused my son's, birth defect disease and ultimate death. And I started to question the way that I was actually trained as a chemist. And I came to the startling realization that I had never had any courses in toxicology. I never had any courses in environmental mechanisms. And come to think of it, not one university on the planet that gives degrees in chemistry, whether undergraduate, master's, or doctorates, not one university on the planet requires students to take courses in how do you identify whether a molecule is toxic or not? How do you, avoid using them in the first place? And I realized that something had to change, that this is just crazy. My father was an electrician. He couldn't come to your house and change a light bulb without having some documentation that said he could do it safely. But the state of the art right now in 2010 is anybody can synthesize a molecule that has never existed before in the universe and have no responsibility to anticipate whether it's the most potent carcinogen, the most, potent neurotoxin in history. That, for some reason, we've evolved that that's somebody else's job after we've made the molecule. And it's just got to change.
That's the realization you came to that really changed the focus of your work, and in some sense this is a positive story because that realization has actually led to an impact on the whole field. The thing that you stated a moment ago, that no university in the entire world had chemists, whether in undergraduate or graduate, required to learn about toxicity and safety, still the case?
Yeah, sadly it is. Now, if someone is going into the field of toxicology or they're going into the field of health, related, chemistries, then they may have, a course like that offered to them. But systematically, to say that this is a primary requirement to practice chemistry, that's not happening anywhere. Okay,
and what about when someone goes to study green chemistry, which I suppose can happen a few places at this point?
Well, there's a handful of programs that offer degrees in green chemistry. But again, the point is that's to the initiated, tiny minority of students that have identified this as a career path and want to do it. It's not a fix for, society at large. The way I look at it is, I kind of look at it as the same model that happens in big industry. Big industry now doesn't really innovate all that well. And so what happens is small little startup companies sprout and have really good ideas, and then big industry gobbles it up and turns it and acquires it, and it becomes part of big industry after it's been tested. My vision is to have these small, the academic institutions are equally as large as industry and equally incapable of innovation and, and change. And so by having a special thing called green chemistry demonstrate its success, my hope is that eventually it'll be gobbled up by acquisition into the mainstream of chemistry, and that's the path forward. To try to change from within is so difficult. So instead demonstrate its success, in these tiny little pockets, and then hopefully it'll be brought into the mainstream eventually.
Right, but that is a model, as we know, with startups and innovation incubators and all of those sorts of things that actually people believe in because it works.
Right.
Yeah. Absolutely. So so this realization for you and this dawning that led you to say, okay, there's something new, which eventually became green chemistry, something new that's needed. That was in the early 90s, right?
Yes.
So here we are in 2010. We're 20 years into this. Could you give me and listeners a sense of where things stand now and what you hope in 5 or 10 years? What the vision of you and others are?
Okay. Well, there's a couple different things to start out with. We live in a society today that is just highly polarized. We have people screaming from the extremes constantly just to be heard. And every simple discussion evolves to an epic battle between good and evil. And throughout the last several decades, environmental protection, human health and the environment has kind of poised itself as one of these, yet again, epic battles of good and evil. You've got the environmental activist community trying to protect people, and they poise industry as being this evil empire, and then you have industry looking at, environmental activists, a bunch of crazies, and no one's on the same page. And really, when it comes down to it, my whole position is that they're not getting it. Either side doesn't get it. It's not an epic battle of good and evil. The fact of the matter is that industry, if it could, would unequivocally do green chemistry. If you think about it, by definition, what green chemistry is a technology that, yes, it has some environmental benefit, but it also must, by definition, have superior performance and superior cost.
Let me cut in for a second, John, so people know what you mean by definition. You're saying, by the way, green chemistry defines itself. It has criteria that go beyond what people assume with green.
Right. The point of green chemistry, when we started talking about this 20 years ago, is that this had to be active pollution prevention. Green chemistry must successfully remove hazard from our society, from our civilization, and to do that, it's gotta, people are not going to buy a cleaner that doesn't work just because it happens to be green. That's just not the way it works. And people are not going to spend an enormous, premium to pay for a product just because it's green. We've got years of experience showing that just doesn't happen. So in order to accomplish these things, what we need to do is to meet all three criteria: the environmental performance, the actual product performance, and cost. And so by definition, what I mean by that is that I think it's clear that anyone would want green chemistry. The problem is that the workforce that industry hires isn't yet capable of doing green chemistry because the academic institutions are not training them.
Okay? So let me just for one more time for listeners. So green chemistry, for a technology to be considered green chemistry, it must accomplish three things. It must be more environmentally benign than existing alternatives. It must be more economically viable than existing alternatives, and it must be functionally equivalent or outperform existing alternatives. So you have set the bar very high and thus made it very clear that there is a financial, an environmental, and a customer function benefit, or it ain't green chemistry.
Yeah, and I state that as just a recognition of the way the world works.
Exactly.
You build a better mousetrap and people beat a path to your door. We can't ram inferior products down society's throats because it's environmentally benign. We can try through regulation, through various laws, but historically that has shown not to be as successful. There are other ways of doing it. So I'm not saying this is the only way, but the best way to to a sustainable future is to understand why it is that people make hazardous materials in the first place and address that. Instead of after the fact saying, okay, keep making the hazardous materials, and then we'll install other things in society to remove them. Why don't we just stop making them in the first place? And so then once you wrap your head around that, then it's just, okay, well, how do we train chemists? And
right.
Oh my God, we don't train them to do this.
Right.
And so over the past 20 years, I've been thrilled by the growth of this. It is growing fairly well. You see pockets of universities that are embracing green chemistry. You see a lot of industry that's embracing green chemistry. I've been to over 30 countries in the world that are have green chemistry programs going on to change the way they teach and do chemistry. It's happening, but it's happening in an incremental way. It's not happening systematically yet. And I think the first point, the first necessary step to true systematic change is, having academia realize that this is going to be a requirement, not an option.
Right. Now, let me. You have an interesting note on the Warner Babcock site. You say 10% of current technologies are environmentally benign. Another 35% could be made benign relatively easily, but that leaves 65% of environmentally benign alternatives have yet to be invented.
Absolutely.
So that tells us two things, right? One, we've got a lot of work to do, but two, it's an enormous opportunity.
Exactly, and that's exactly the point, is that the way I look at it, again, if we just imagine everything we interact with in society, the ceiling tiles, the carpeting, our clothing, the electronics that we use, the cosmetics, all the cars that we drive, if we consider everything that industry supplies society right now, I would argue that perhaps maybe 10% escape scrutiny. They're non-toxic, they're environmentally benign, they're from renewable resources, they degrade into the environment. They are consistent with what I call the 12 principles of green chemistry. So maybe 10% of them are doing that. Now, there is this concept called alternatives assessment, in which there's a mandate for organizations to do everything they can to scour the earth to find the best available technology. So if you're sourcing a product and you're buying it, you should do a Google search to find all the vendors that supply similar items and find the best available technology. That's a very important thing for us to do, but I feel that maybe 25% of the time that's going to come out to be successful. That most of the time there are no better alternatives. Sometimes there will be, so we might be able to get another 25% or so. But most of the time, at least 65% of the time, that search will fail. And what we'll find is that there are no available technologies. And so that means that someone has to invent it. And you can't schedule an invention. You can't say, next Tuesday at 2:30, I'm going to invent a solution to a problem. It's just not the way it works. However, we can look at this in despair. We could say, oh, my God, the sky is falling down. What a terrible situation. Or we could say, wait a minute, this is what better time in history to be in the business of chemistry. Society desperately needs us to do this. Now we're not talking only about pollution prevention. We're not talking only about human health and the environment. This is now put together with economic development, jobs creation. If you can have an entity, be it a state government or a corporation, recognize that this is an unmet need, well, filling unmet needs is part of prosperity in an economy, especially a global economy. So if we can put the tools together and create organizations or places that are training not just the postdocs and the PhDs, but the associate level, the bachelor's level, the high school graduates, to understand green chemistry and to create a workforce capable of providing these products. Now all of a sudden you're saying we're going to protect human health and the environment and create jobs at the same time.
Now let me take a step backward, if you will, with me. And just set some of the situation that we're in, because I sort of referred to it at the top. Okay, so we've talked about where we're going to go, and we'll get back to that. But Could you flesh out for listeners the current state of chemicals in our environment? I referenced that Scientific American article that at one point estimated 50,000. At another point in that same article, it talked about 80,000. So how many chemicals are out there being used? And when we talk about 50 or 80,000, are we talking about all synthetic, or does that include natural chemicals? That's the first question. How many are in use?
Okay. Again, it's kind of a tough thing to tally and count. I'm not sure about the numbers that you referred to. It could have been there were 50,000 at some point, and then there are now 30,000 more, bringing it to a total of 80,000. But that's about the right magnitude.
Okay.
Something like 80,000 molecules out there, materials that are being used by industry in all of our different products. You walk down any store and you look to your left, you see right all the products that are on the shelves. It doesn't take too long before you get into the 10s, 20s, 30s, 40,000 of ingredients and components that are out there.
Yeah. Take anything out of your washroom or out of your refrigerator and read the ingredients. It's right.
Yeah.
You'll get there. Okay.
Exactly.
And I also said that some very, very small number had been tested because there was no requirement to test for safety before putting something on the market. And so the only time it comes that there might be a reason to test is if there's some question and somebody's raising an issue and so on. So do you have a sense of how many are tested, have been tested, that sort of thing out of that?
Like you, this isn't, part of my day job, but obviously I read and look at from what my understanding is, it's something to the order of 600.
Okay. So people got that. So
it's a tiny fraction.
Right. So say there's 60,000 chemicals and say 600 have been tested. Now the other thing that I remember when I interviewed Gina Solomon, who's written about this from her position with the NRDC, but she is a chemist. She points out that most of the tests are only for cancer. Are they carcinogenic or not? Most of the tests are done, and we're talking about only the 600 that have been tested, they look at numbers for adults. They don't look at what that would be like for a child or for fetal development and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And so that's pretty much the case, right?
Yeah. No, it's a very frustratingly complicated problem, and there are some practical problems. Obviously, doing testing is enormously expensive. It can run up to thousands of dollars pretty quickly per molecule, and the workforce doesn't exist out there. And so it can say, okay, well, wait a minute, why don't we force industry to do the test? Well, in our society, as soon as industry pays for a test, no one's going to believe it because they funded the test. So we kind of got to catch 20.
Oh, you're right.
Pay for it, and then once you pay for it, well, you don't believe it because you paid for it. So we're and to be honest with you, if you got 10 toxicologists to sit at the table and say, okay, if you could list 5 tests that should be done, you won't get 10 toxicologists to agree on what those 5 tests should be. And so if it's infinite, if it's okay, there's a test that tests for this, we should do it. There's a test that tests for this, we should do it. Well, before long, you just keep going and adding test after test, and obviously infinity, we can't reach infinity. So as of right now, in 2010, I don't think there's agreement on exactly what tests should be run, and we just have to come to that conclusion. But the point is that we don't even really have a workforce to do it. One of my visions is to relook at this concept of the green economy and the Green Jobs Act and say, why don't we get 200 centers across the country, couple in every state, in which we take high school graduates, displaced auto workers, people that need to have their jobs updated, use these as training centers, have them, meticulously, overseen by, professionals, but use it as on-the-job training and start cranking out data one after another of all these compounds, and at the same time be training a workforce on truly green jobs, understanding biotech and the industry so that, they don't spend their whole life at this job. Once they are educated, they go out into the workforce fully trained. We have an opportunity to be doing worker training, creating jobs, and at the same time getting this desperately needed information. I don't hear anybody talking about doing this.
When they talk about green jobs, they talk about I think
changing light bulbs,
exactly, retrofitting buildings, all of which is important. But you're talking about some very, as I said, upstream, foundational, root cause kind of an approach. What are the dangers? I'm most aware of carcinogens and endocrine disruptors. What are we talking about when we talk about the dangers of chemicals?
Well, it's one of these things where, again, you always worry about, terrifying people, and, when you start listing the potential dangers, what are we talking, tiny chances or super chances or whatnot, but, all of the different diseases that have implications, people have linked, asthma, childhood asthma, type 2 diabetes, learning deficiencies, all kinds of neurological endpoints for children. Cancer is the one that's been around for the longest time, but endocrine disruption is something that's critical. So there are a host of things that are going on, and I think it's important to realize that science is not ever 100% put a dot at the end of the period of the sentence, we're done. The problem is that oftentimes you have some material that is potentially an endocrine disruptor or potentially a carcinogen or potentially something, but, we have a moral and ethical problem here. We don't do human testing. It's just morally and ethically wrong to dose humans, so we dose laboratory animals. There's moral and ethical issues around that. We do, computer modeling and things like that, and at the end of the day, the data does not 100% conclude this is a carcinogen, this is an endocrine disruptor. Sometimes, of course, there are cases that are just absolutely unequivocal, but more often than not, you have scientists debating on whether or not it's really toxic or not. And that's the maddening situation that we end up with all the time, is that, I have never, ever in my life encountered someone from industry who said, yeah, we know this is toxic, but screw it, we're going to sell it anyways. That's just not what happens. What people say, and I honestly believe them, is they say, we don't believe that this is toxic.
Yeah.
And if we don't believe that this is toxic, why should we pull it from the shelves and put people out of work that are dependent on making this stuff? And so what happens is again, the epic battle of good and evil gets unveiled.
Right.
And you talk about the evil of this and stuff like that. But it's not really about good and evil. It's real, honest, sincere people, for the most part. Of course, there are exceptions, but for the most part, that just disagree on that side. So my whole point, let's render the entire discussion moot by having 10 alternatives that are safe.
Right. That's the point you make over and over again, is that given human nature, given the way work works, given the way industry works, this is what it's going to take. Now, I have this line quoted: the efficient way to rid society of potentially hazardous materials is to promote the invention of alternatives. And everything, am I correct, kind of unfolds from that. In other words, how do we do that? And then when you approach the question of how do we do that, we've heard you talk about education. We've heard you talk about training. One of the things I think you said was that people, I think people who listen to the good and evil discussion believe that the alternatives exist, but they're being held back, right? And what you say is that, as we've pointed out before, that in a huge number of cases, as you said, probably 65%, they don't exist yet, and the progress is only incremental. So if you were, the notion is ridiculous, but if you were the green chemistry czar, right? What would be the 10-year plan? And then what we will get to next after you lay this out is I want you to tell listeners, and so listeners, stay tuned. What I want you to talk about after we talk about what you see for the future is to relay success stories.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so the 10-year plan, I think, is we need to get curricula into universities and colleges, 4-year, 2-year colleges, and in the K through 12 education community. We need to come up with good curriculum that teaches, I'm not talking about mechanistic toxicology, the science of looking at a molecule and anticipating its harm, as being a career path. Obviously, there are people who make careers out of mechanistic toxicology. We're going to have to desperately rely on them, and they've been working for decades in honing their skill and getting better and better at doing this. What I want is a simple class that trains the chemists to be able to communicate with the mechanistic toxicologists, not to become mechanistic toxicologists, but at least communicate with them. And so the first thing we need to do is to come up with some kind of a mandate or whatever to have universities create these courses. Now, the beautiful thing about that is once those courses are created, yes, the next generation of students will start taking them. But more importantly, people already in industry will have those courses available. Industry sends their employees to universities all the time. Imagine having some kind of a federal program that acknowledges that if you have a tuition reimbursement program for an employee going to get higher education and it's around green chemistry, there could be some tax incentive or something like that. There are many ways through policy that we could promote the adoption creation of these skill sets. And so that's, the first thing we've got to do is as quickly as possible is come up with that process.
And when you talk about chemists being able, or students of chemistry even being able to communicate with those who are really the experts in the toxicology, what you're talking about partially here is a change of kind of the way a chemist sees their role, the way a chemist sees chemistry. It's very basic stuff, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely. So right now, let's say, that my job as a chemist is to invent a dye for a fabric. Okay, I can point to the class that taught me how to synthesize a dye, what atoms need to be in what place to make a certain color. I can point to the classes that I took that taught me and prepared me to how to make that dye stick to the fabric and not fall off in the wash. I can point to the class that said how to make it not fade in sunlight, how to make it not oxidize in the air. So there's all this stuff, and my job has been, okay, make the dye, test it, make sure it sticks to the fabric, make sure that it does all the things that it's supposed to do. Somebody else later says, well, wait a minute, that dye's toxic. And so then what happens is a disconnect of, oh, really? So we go back to the drawing board or something happens. If on the day that I started that process, I just saw toxicity as yet another product descriptor. It's got to be a certain color, it's got to stick to a fabric, and oh, by the way, it's got to be safe. If we could just put that into the mindset as just being another simple criteria for success of a chemist, then therefore they must, have the training to be able to achieve that success. Eventually that will just become who we are and what we're doing. So my big dream is to actually put green chemistry out of business and never say it ever again.
Right. That
just be chemistry.
That's right. That chemistry includes that question at the very start.
Yeah. And it's really kind of interesting. We've all had science classes in high school and in junior high school. If I were to go to any group in society, I don't care if they're, middle school teachers, high school students, college graduates, graduate students, CEOs, take any group of people and do an experiment. I'm going to hold a glass of water in front of a group. And I'm going to say, go back to whatever science class you ever had. Remember you learned about physical and chemical properties. How would you describe this glass of water? Well, someone would say it's a liquid. Someone will say it's colorless. Someone will say it melts at 0 degrees centigrade. Someone will say it boils at 100 degrees centigrade. They'll start scratching their heads trying to think of other ways of describing it. But ironically, it's unlikely that anyone in our society would say it's non-toxic. It has negligible impact in the environment. For some reason, when we think of chemical and physical properties, we don't think of them. And of course, they're just like all the other chemical and physical properties. We can learn and understand how the structure impacts with its function and all of that. But for some reason, we've evolved to not do that. The moment that education, that's why I say it's going to go all the way through K through 12 education.
Mm-hmm. That's what I thought too, yes.
As long as we can accept that, okay, this is something that we can deal with, and it's not, and we can get out of this mess. That's the path forward. Now, it's not going to be quick. There's no magic green button that I can hit and all of a sudden every product becomes safe. Chemistry has been around in its modern embodiment for over 150 years. and we haven't been thinking this way. Green chemistry started 20 years ago. It's only been picking up steam the last 10 years. We can't reinvent 150 years of chemistry in a decade. This is going to take a long time. So we have to figure out how do we get to that point on the horizon that we need to be in.
We're now going to go to, I think, what is, to some extent, the good news, which is movement forward. Now, what is the relationship between green chemistry and innovation? Intuitively, I assume it's a virtuous cycle, that they both drive each other, that when you say we're focusing on a new question in almost any process, it leads people to a more innovative space than they were in when they were just going through what they were going through yesterday.
Yeah, it'd be beautiful. You just get it. That's exactly true. But unfortunately, perception rules in so many cases. I completely subscribe to exactly what you just said. But what happens is oftentimes green chemistry is represented or spoken of in the wrong terms. And it's actually talked about as a set of handcuffs, a set of limitations. It's telling chemists what not to do. Okay, well, if you're doing chemistry, if you're going to abide by green chemistry, don't use this. Don't use this. And so the misperception is that to do green chemistry, you just remove a bunch of tools from your toolbox to go forward. But of course, my whole point is that necessity being the mother of invention, you've got industries that have been around for 30, 40 years with everybody thinking one way.
Yeah.
If you introduce the concept of green chemistry and say, we should do it this way, and they're open-minded and they actually approach it, all of a sudden they're in a very different space. And innovation goes through the roof. And I think that there are a few companies that are starting to get that, and they actually do and bring in green chemistry into the training of their scientists, not just to meet regulation and things like that, but to actually use it as a kick in the pants as far as innovation is concerned. And hands down, organizations that get it and bring it in at that level always, not sometimes, but always reap the rewards of innovation.
Sure.
In my opinion.
You create a more creative space. You change the music. You change the feel of the room. You change the pursuit, and people wake up.
Well, it's interesting. I'm old. 25 years ago, I was learning chemistry. It was a huge subject. There were a lot of students learning chemistry. And the concept of industrial design didn't even really exist. And now today, many universities and colleges, people are getting degrees in design and things like that. And the chemistry departments, the people getting degrees in chemistry are going down. Now, what does a designer do? A designer takes a bunch of materials, puts them together to invent a product. We have more and more designers that are making more and more products, but of the same materials.
Sure.
The materials are stagnant. So if in green chemistry you invent a new material that's environmentally benign, that is safe, and you put that in the hands of the designers, they all of a sudden have a brand new tool that they never had before, and that is the key to innovation. All of a sudden now they can use it here, they can put it there, they can do this with it, they can do that with it, so that if the chemist can come up with a new innovative material that is environmentally benign, it will be widespread adopted everywhere it can.
Of course. Yeah, but I mean, for one thing, we just love novelty of any sort. But that's another thing. Brand new, improved this is what people love to slam on a product. Let me just ask one thing, not again to go to the good versus evil or make it about that, but I'm going to read a couple of quotes that I've got from some stuff you've written. China has opened up something like 40 national research centers for green chemists. And China, if you want federal funding, you've got to have green chemistry in the title of your proposal. India's Ministry of Education is piloting a program where all chemists take a one-year course in green chemistry. In the U.S., you'd be hard-pressed to find any program that incorporates it. Talk about that.
Yeah, I think, again, there's a couple of things, ways of looking at that. One, in the West, we are just wildly successful in industry and academia. And when one is perceived or considers oneself widely successful, why change? If it ain't broke, why fix it?
Yeah.
Yet if India and China are trying to become competitive on a global scale, they're going to need to find that innovative edge. And I believe they are, and they're recognizing that. Now, again, we have to resist any kind of nationalist, warfare here of technology and innovation. We're all in this together. We're all breathing the same air on the planet. So we got to applaud any organization, any country that's getting it, but we need to find a way of working together. And so in China, you're absolutely right. There's something like 14 national labs doing green chemistry, and again, it's interesting. In the United States, we have evolved to really focus on this concept called nanotechnology. And over the last decade, well over $10 billion have been allocated to science in the field of nanotechnology. And so I tongue-in-cheek say if you need to have federal funding in science, you better put the word nanotech in your title. Imagine, can you name any university or college that doesn't have a nano center, a nano program?
Right.
10 years ago, none of them did.
Right.
And now 10 years later, every single university has one. Is it because that they all just woke up and said, man, we should do this? Or was it because federal funding was created and they said, gee, if we want this funding, we better do it? So it's interesting that policy from that perspective absolutely drives the adoption of technologies across academia. And so can you imagine if we had a similar amount of funding where every college and university had a green chemistry center and everyone was working on developing non-toxic, environmentally benign technologies for society? It's almost staggering that we don't, but we don't.
Yeah, a couple of things I hear, though, if I'm listening to kind of themes in this conversation, is you say design didn't used to be a big player, now it's a big player in education. Nanotechnology was not a big area, now it's a big area. That, to me, is also good news. In other words, things can change quickly.
Absolutely.
So that's a good thing. And the other thing is, in terms of what we're saying about green chemistry as a source of innovation, the fact that China and India are making those moves is because they believe that.
Yes.
Right? In other words, the reason they're putting their money where their mouth is over there is because they've got to find an area that we're not ahead in and try to seize the leadership.
Well, again, and again, I'm familiar with the works of Thomas Friedman. He brings this up all the time. How green has to be the new red, white, and blue, and how the whole concept of sustainability, environmental protection is truly the next wave of industrial competitiveness, and it's just something that we have to wrap ourselves around and figure out how to address.
Okay, so finally, the part that I left out when I was doing the introduction, John, was I had some stuff about the big corporations and the startups that have used it and the products that they've altered. And so now we've got about 7 minutes left. What is some of the good news that's happening that people could actually pick up on a shelf today or in a year or two?
Okay, well, first, in 1996, there began a Presidential Green Chemistry Challenge Award Program. This is something that started in the U.S. government, primarily under the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. And back in 1996, they started a program to actually find corporations and individuals that were developing technologies that were green chemistry, that were successful in the marketplace from a performance and a cost perspective. And every year, about 200 nominations enter into the system, and 5 awards are given to technologies that demonstrate the principles of green chemistry and the cost effectiveness and product performance and whatnot. So that was created in the Clinton and Gore administration. It survived transition to the Bush administration and is now still going strong in the Obama administration. So it's a wonderful apolitical thing that has gone through. And so every year at the National Academy of Sciences in Washington, D.C., these 5 awards are given. And so if you go to the U.S. EPA website in green chemistry, or just Google Presidential Green Chemistry Challenge Awards, you'll find over 70 case studies that document the technology in words that even non-chemists can understand and appreciate. Explain how companies have invented, new materials to do different things, how, that they're making strides. But, and so I really encourage people listening to go to that website and see that, this can happen, this does happen. But there's a little bit, again, of an interesting twist here, because if you think about it, say you're a company that is selling something and you're concerned that there's a societal backlash that fears that a component is nasty, is dangerous, is hazardous. Well, but your product is selling and people like it. So what you want to do is you want to invent a material that at best is invisible to the public, right? Because they already like the product.
Right.
And so if success is invisibility, we've got kind of a problem.
A PR problem here, yeah.
Right. Well, the problem is, and it's kind of interesting if you think about it. If I had a replacement technology that everybody loved, nobody was afraid of it, everybody thought that it was safe, it was cost effective, it had good performance, everyone would use it. Every end of line, product maker would replace whatever they're buying with that, and it would just infiltrate all of industry. Okay. However, we have this problem in the world in that if a few people can make a lot of money, the resources will be made available to invent an alternative. If a lot of people are going to make a little money, that initial investment is hard to come by. And so we have this crazy way that the economy works, that once it's invented, everyone will use it. But to invent something costs a lot of money, and no one's going to make a big amount of money invisibly replacing a component of a product that's already on the market. It's just going to cannibalize an existing market. And so that initial creation, the funding, the money available to have that first invention take place is the most difficult step. And that's where we need to, once it's invented, everyone's going to love it and use it.
Yeah.
And then all the regulations can come in to mandate its use, and society has mechanisms to take an existing technology and push it through the pipeline. But we don't have a mechanism to invent. And so looking at these winners of these awards to try to figure out, why did they do what they did? How did they get the funding? What is it? And you'll find oftentimes it is a new product that offers the benefit, but it isn't the old product. And so we need to again look at this in two ways. Making new products is easy. You claim all these great claims, but replacing something in an old product, well, first of all, it's invisible, but there's another problem too, and that is if you're a big company selling a product and people say that some component is dangerous and you don't believe them, you can't really say, we replaced it because we agree it's dangerous. It kind of opens them up to a heap of liability.
Oh, geez. Yeah.
Right? And so hey, I last year I was selling you something that was dangerous and was killing you, but this year I replaced it, so thank me. That's just not the way things work either.
We got some perverse incentives here, don't we, John?
Absolutely. And so what we got to realize is that the enemy of the excellent is the perfect, okay? And perfect is unattainable. What I call it is we need to look into our hearts and identify what I call molecular redemption. We've got to find companies that are doing it right. Stop looking at the vilification process and creating the good and evil and saying, well, in the past you used to do this. We've got to find a way to get a pathway that people can do the right thing, and we can work together doing the right thing. If all we do is keep referring to what happened in the past, then we just spiral into what we've been doing for the last 40 years. It's interesting. My vision, the way I look at it, is for 40 years we've been shaking our fist at industry saying, don't do this, don't do that. Now, all of a sudden, green chemistry is saying, talk to the child at the fence post of a factory spewing out nasty. Say to that child, go to school, be a good student, become a chemist, walk in the front door, and say, do this instead. And offering the positive solution instead of just the fist shaking. And I'm not suggesting for a second that we stop shaking our fists. Okay, that process works and is necessary for driving the regulatory process and everything else. What I'm saying is we have to match those efforts with the innovation component.
Right. Let me I will just because I sort of promised it, I really understand what you're saying and how the incentives are perverse, but I am going to read from that Scientific American article from May 2010 that I quoted at the top, in which she says, big corporations, Monsanto, Dow, Merck, Pfizer, DuPont, along with scrappy startups, are already applying green chemistry techniques. There have been hundreds of innovations, from safer latex paints, household cleaning products, saran wrap, to textiles made from cornstarch, pesticides that work selectively by disrupting the life cycles of troublesome insects. Investigators have also developed cleaner ways of decaffeinating coffee, dry cleaning clothes, making styrofoam egg cartons, and producing drugs like Advil, Zoloft, and Lipitor. So just a list of the very basic, normal things that have been being improved. So again, John Warner, we've been talking about green chemistry. Where can listeners learn more, and is there anything that they can do to make your vision come quicker?
I'd like to point out beyondbenign.org.
Okay.
The words beyondbenign.org is a nonprofit organization run by Dr. Amy Cannon, and she's also my wife. She with me and co-located with the Warner Babcock Institute, is developing all kinds of tools for community education, K-12 education, undergraduate education. There's tons of resources free to download from the web, not even in PDF format, but in editable Word format for any educator, anyone who wants to bring curriculum into their classroom or to get a better understanding of this at any level of education. I encourage people to go to that website and just bask in all of the information.
Wonderful. Okay, I'm going to close it there. So that's Beyond Benign, one word, beyondbenign.org. I've been speaking with John Warner, one of the founders of Green Chemistry. You can learn more at warnerbabcock.com or epa.gov/GCC, or it sounds like the most user-friendly is going to be at beyondbenign, one word.org. You can listen to this week's conversation and many others anytime by linking to the podcast. You can sign up to have it delivered to you weekly. You can do both of those things at either iTunes or at my own site, TerrenceMcNally.net. And if you want to receive my weekly email announcement of upcoming guests and issues, you can either sign up at my website, TerrenceMcNally.net, or email me at temcnally@mac.com, temcnally@mac.com. You can also sign up at iTunes or the site to have it delivered to you. You can subscribe to the podcast. Thank you to John Warner. Keep up the good work.